It's time to take command with former NFL tight end Logan Paulsen and former Commanders beat reporter Craig Hoffman.
What's up? What's happening? Welcome in. Take Command Podcast. Logan Paulsen there. Craig Hoffman here. And it is time to preview the Commanders showdown as they get back on the field after the mini-bye with the Dallas Cowboys. For those watching on YouTube, yes, I still am in Uncle Craig's Football Emporium here in Columbus, Ohio, where it's snowing outside, Logan. It's snowing.
Yeah, dude. Get that winter feel, winter vibes, you know?
Yeah, speaking of winter vibes, what's more wintry than a division football game at the end of November?
I know, right?
Gotta love it. This is the time of year that the Commanders often play the Cowboys, obviously, whether it's Thanksgiving, the week after, in this case, the week before. And Logan, not only is it a division game, it's a division game where these two teams are coming off opposite rests, if you will. Commanders with the mini-bye, Cowboys coming off Monday Night Football. Frankly, it's something the NFL shouldn't do, in my opinion. Like, the schedule makers need to put this into their formula to prevent it from happening. And it's happened actually quite a few times this year around the league where teams, one team on long rest, one team on short rest. It's one thing like, okay, teams coming off a bye, they have to play someone. You can't just play all the teams coming off of the buys, but to have it against a short week, have you ever been that you can remember in this situation on one side of it or the other? And just generally speaking, like, how do you think this affects the football game?
Yeah, I mean, I don't remember ever personally having to play on a short week like that. But again, I'm sure it's happened. Like I'm not like some guys are really good at remembering exactly like the week schedules and all that type of stuff. I'm not that great at that, but I do think it's tough. I mean, I think anytime you get a guy coming off of a shorter kind of short kind of time frame, and then you have more time off, it's definitely a competitive advantage. And I know that they're trying always to kind of mitigate that and avoid that as much as possible. But it definitely, I think, hurts. It hurts the team on the short week. Like, there's no way around it. Like, you're not as healthy, you're not as prepared. All of those things kind of stack up to make it really, really challenging for the opponent. And I think, if you're a Commanders fan, like, that's okay. You've had some tough draws this week or this season in terms of schedule. I think the Cowboys probably have had some easier draws in terms of schedule. Like, to me, it all kind of works out in the wash, but definitely something that I think the schedule makers should be aware of 100%.
Alas, they have not, and the Commanders get the advantage. It's also a division game, Logan, which we've talked about how these can be impactful before, the familiarity, although this one's kind of a weird one in terms of the matchups here, because you have the head coach here in Washington, who was the defensive coordinator last year in Dallas, so talk about knowing the personnel down there. He knows, obviously, the head coach in Mike McCarthy, who's also, in this case, the play caller. But you don't have the familiarity necessarily for Cliff Kingsbury and Mike Zimmer, although Zimmer's a known commodity, been around the league for a long time. So how does and by the way, it's the first time they've matched up this year. But you do have guys who have obviously played against each other year over year. More so on the Dallas side, although the Commanders had the more roster turnover than anyone in football. Like, we could parse it all these different ways, but ultimately for this matchup, how does the divisional nature of it and also like the intensity of it, how does that change this week?
Yeah, I definitely think this is going to be a really unique matchup for this team, and it's for a lot of the reasons you talked about there. I mean, Dan having just coached there, Dan knowing Mike super well, Mike knowing Dan super well. Like, talk about the ultimate scouting report. Like, you've literally practiced against these people for years. Like, we had a brief meeting, for the game plan show that airs on Sunday before kickoff with Dan. He was like, yeah, I used to go to Cooper Rush and be like, hey man, do you think this is man or do you think this is zone? Like, and I was just like, that's such a weird conversation to be having. Like, obviously you trust him, you trust his perspective, but like, that's how well you know each other, and that's how well Mike knows you. And I think about Tyler Biadasz, I think about Armstrong, I think about all of these elements that were brought from Dallas that are now competing. And as a player that's done that a couple of times in my career, going from Washington to Chicago, then playing Washington, and then going from Chicago to San Francisco and playing Chicago and Washington again, like, you get up in a different way for those opportunities. It's like you're trying to, I don't know if you're trying to prove anything, but you're trying to, like Dan explained it the best, it's like you're trying to beat up your brother a little bit, and that's kind of what it feels like. And so I definitely believe that the divisional nature of the game, obviously that's super important. Obviously that's going to motivate people and be up. And Dan mentioned it when we were getting ready for that show that they've shown old clips of the rivalry just to make sure some of the young people understand the impact of it. So obviously it's prescient, but to me it's the relationships that are, Joe Witt Jr. was just there, the whole defense, like those are the relationships that are going to really drive this, I think, and make this maybe even more competitive than a normal division rivalry, because familiarity breeds contempt. And I don't know if it's contempt is the right word in this case, but it definitely breeds a harder competitive environment. And I think that's something that I really can't wait to see, and how they get the game plan worked out, knowing that they know that you know, and all that kind of stuff. So I think that's what makes me really excited for this game. It's not as much the divisional stuff. Well, that's important. It's the fact that they're so close in terms of personality and experience.
Yeah, for sure. I have a lot of new listeners since the last time you told this story. So I'm going to ask you to tell a story. I'm going to ask you, we go to story time with Logan, because often you get people asking like, oh, well, could Tyler Biadasz, like, will the defense go to Tyler Biadasz and be like, hey, what do you know about this guy? Or like, kind of that personal scouting report from practicing against a guy, or a coach, for instance, and especially on a coach. So, would the defensive staff go to Tyler Biadasz and be like, hey, what's Mike McCarthy thinking here? And you had quite the experience with this when you were in Houston. Can you tell the J.J. Watt Houston prep story of when you faced, it was Kyle, right?
Yeah, so it was we were playing Atlanta. So I just left Atlanta. So I think it was I forget who the OC was, but it was just there.
Sark?
I knew all the Sark had just left. It was the guy who just was in Tampa. Gosh, I'm bad with names. But so I just left, and I am a very fastidious note taker. And so obviously, they let me go, and it didn't work out in Atlanta. No hard feelings, but they came to me. They were like, hey, man, do you have any notes, that you could share with us? So I was like, yeah, let me go through my notes. And so basically I had literally all of their 2-minute calls, all of their cadence work, all of their kind of first and second down priority calls, like that they just liked in general, and was able to install all, like I'd go in the defensive would come up to me and I'd install all of their run calls. So like, hey, on the front side of, power, this is the calls they're going to say. And on the front side of this, they're going to say this. And if it's play action pass, they're going to say this. And basically, JJ Watt came up to me and said, like, that's like the most detailed report we've gotten from anybody from a different team. And all the coaches came up to me and said the same thing. And one of the defensive backs came up to me after the game and said, man, like, you were right. Like, all their 2-minute plays were their 2-minute plays. And I was like, yeah, like, they're not going to change them. Like, that's what they do. And, they said, what are their favorite? So, like, you just kind of I basically installed as much as I could remember of the offense to the defense and let them kind of run with it. And, like that's the NFL. And so I do think that's why this matchup to me is so interesting, because there's nobody who knows Mike McCarthy's offense better than Dan Quinn. And Mike McCarthy probably knows Dan Quinn's defense better than everybody in the NFL at this point. So I think that's going to be really fun to see kind of what wrinkles you bring to the party, especially as you already alluded to. They have a little bit of time off. They have an extra couple of days off to self-scout and get ready. So what does that matchup look like?
Yeah. The punchline to that story was also that's like the only time Watt ever talked to you when you were in Houston.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, that's true. Like, he came up to me, like, and I had been there for 8-9 weeks, and he goes, like, and he just out of the blue was like, and he was and he used it in a very interesting way. And, obviously JJ Watt, great player. And, one of the most dominant defensive players in the NFL. So you're kind of around him and you're just like, is he going to talk to me? Whatever. And he comes up to me just out of the blue, like, not even really introducing himself, and was like, man, our offensive line could never handle all the cadence stuff they do. And I was like, yeah. It's like, but, Matt really emphasizes it. And he's like, yeah, our guys are too dumb. And then just walked away. And I was like, cool. Like, nice talking to you, JJ. And back to the drawing board. Again, like, great player. Interesting to be in a locker room with him. But, it leads to fun stories like that.
Yes, and that's what podcasts are for. Knowledge, information, previews. No, it's story time with Logan. That's why we're all
that's
here.
Right.
Take Command Podcast. That's Logan Paulson. I am Craig Hoffman. All right, that's enough story time with Logan. Let's dive into the actual preview itself. Logan, let's start off with the Commanders' offense, which is kind of dominating the narrative here as people are like, are they in a regression? Is it Jaden? Is it the injury? Is it Cliff in a regression? All of these things. We talked about this on the film review show with Philly, that we think a lot of this just has to do with the opponents. They look like teams playing, or an offense playing some of the best defenses in football. And even in some of those matchups, they've done better than many other teams, including the Pittsburgh game where they put up 27 points. And Logan, have you ever done something or just had like a really rough patch of your schedule, like your life schedule, and you feel really constricted, and you look ahead to the task that's in front of you next after you survive that rough patch, and you just feel freedom? Because that's what it felt like watching the Cowboys defense on film. This is a unit where there's air to be had. You can run the football on them. This feels much more like watching some of the units that this team put 40 on earlier in the season. That is not to say that they're not talented. It's not to say that Mike Zimmer is not a great coordinator. He's one of the really, kind of grandfathers of a lot of tenants that are currently in a lot of NFL defenses. Obviously the AA blitz package, so the two linebackers right there over the center, just threatening over him at all times. So there's a lot to unpack here that we can get into, but this does feel like a chance for the Commanders offense to get back to the high scoring, high output ways that they had earlier in the season.
Yeah, I think so. And I think you kind of you described that really well, because it's not like that they're personnel wise, they don't feel bad. They feel like they're fine. And it just feels like they're kind of almost like they're still learning the defense a little bit. Like when you watch some of the coverage stuff, you can tell guys aren't completely on the same page. When they're doing run fits, their nickel players are kind of in a weird bind, and they're kind of late to the run fit, and there's too much air and they miss a tackle. It kind of reminds me a little bit of the Commanders earlier in the year when it comes to some of the run fit stuff, where there's a quarter player and he's fitting from depth and it's just too hard of a tackle. They didn't anticipate the run. And so I do think there's a lot of that, but also there's times where they flash, like Micah Parsons will set a great edge, and, Maze Smith and Digizua will kind of like work down line of scrimmage. They'll close it up. They'll bottle it in, and the nickel player will come in and make a really nice tackle. Donovan Wilson does a great job of that, or Donovan Wilson, does a great job of that. So there are plays and there are moments where you're like, oh, this is like good stuff. But I just think the consistency isn't there on a down to down basis. They are kind of this quarters. They play a lot of Tampa 2. They play a lot of cover 3 more than I thought. And man coverage is probably a little bit down for them. And so I just think about, kind of to your point, when Jaden does well, and he does really well when pre-snap he knows the coverage. Pre-snap he kind of can identify where the soft spot's going to be and then work through his progression really quickly. And I think that's what this game's going to afford him the opportunity to do. And I think you couple that with the ability to run the football. Because like I said, they do some good stuff in terms of stopping the run. They're physical. They're aggressive downhill. Before we're getting on, you talked about Eric Kendricks and kind of how he's got this old man kind of football to him where he's really savvy. He knows how to fit runs. And, they do a good job. But there are enough opportunities, and I think the Houston game encapsulates this perfectly, where they misfit stuff. They're not on the same page. They're not locked in, and it leads to explosive runs. They miss tackles. And so if B-Rob can get going, and again, we get back to this offense, the Commanders' offense gets back to this efficient first down when we're in 2nd and 6, we're in 2nd and 5, then everything's on the table for Cliff from a play calling standpoint. I think we're going to see a version of the offense that we saw versus the New York Giants, versus the Bears, versus whoever. And again, this is not an indictment of them as a defensive group. It's just the consistency that we saw versus Philly, versus Pittsburgh. Their interior unit specifically also, I think, the defensive tackles for Pittsburgh, the defensive tackles for Philly are a different caliber of group compared to this. And so all of those things that gave the Commanders offense issues aren't really present here the way that they've been the past couple of weeks. And so it does feel like it's an opportunity to get back on track. Now, you still need to prep. You still need to make sure you make the plays. You still need to make sure you're executing at a really high level and go out and punch these guys in the mouth. But defensively, schematically, personnel-wise, the opportunity feels a little bit less difficult.
Yeah, it's funny because there's like some real, not dichotomies, but there's some real like oxymorons almost in this defense where it's like I feel like this is a defense that has a lot of team speed but doesn't play necessarily fast, if that makes sense. Like
Right.
they will have guys fly to the football individually, but it's not like they're on you right now in the way that there's the urgency and suddenness of Philly or Pittsburgh, where all the windows are really tight and all that kind of stuff. So like you'll have a catch for 20 yards on a crosser, and then Donovan Wilson will come down and hit you with some speed. But that speed would have been better applied earlier in the down to not allow the 20-yard crosser in the first place. Mike is his own animal, and we can talk about him and why he's not been quite as impactful in a second. But I also think same thing inside. Like you'll see Odigizua make an incredible, just like quick movement inside, get a sack, but he's also not they're light inside. And so you can move them, and you see that show up. And sometimes that's the reason why some of these run fits are a lot harder. In the same way that we talked about earlier in the season with the Commanders, right? Like, oh, Chin's missing tackles. It's like, yeah, the hole's 8 yards wide. It's pretty hard for a safety to do that. And so there's some of that's happening at times as well. And so it's an interesting defense because Mike Zimmer's great. A lot of their players have really good traits. It doesn't feel like it fits together in any kind of cohesive way.
Yeah, and again, like that group's been playing in the Dan Quinn defense for a couple of years now, and so you can tell there's some new rules, some new setups. They are carrying, I don't want to say a lot of volume, but probably more volume than they did with Dan. Like Dan, you were playing, or when he was the defensive coordinator in Dallas, it's like you were playing a lot of man, you were playing a lot of Tampa 2, and that's what you did. And so now they've got quarters, and quarters has different rules versus different formations and fronts. You've got cover 3, you've got your man, you've got Tampa 2, you've got you mentioned the double A package that he's kind of notarized and brought to the NFL. That's still a big part of them, but that is complicated to do up front, right? And on third down, like that's a whole install you got to do. And so it just feels like there are times where they're not super locked in on every single detail. It's not super locked in on exact run fits, not super locked in on exactly how to pass certain things off. And there are times where you're like, that is for sure wrong. That can't be how they're supposed to do it. And there's a guy wide open, like you were talking about on the crosser, for example. Like usually in quarters, right? So then when there's 4 guys across the back of the defense, a corner, safety, corner, and the guy's running across the formation, usually the backside safety is supposed to cut that guy, right? But they aren't communicating it well. They aren't on the same page all the time, and it leads to explosive plays. And that's what they're usually supposed to do. But sometimes, depending on the call or depending on the formation, maybe the front side guy is supposed to cut and supposed to play like man. Like, and you can just tell they're not all the way there with some of those details. And I think, I think honestly, if the offense was playing better, we wouldn't be talking about the defense as being the 31st worst. Run defense, the 29th worst defense in terms of points. I don't think we're talking about them quite that same way. But the fact is the offense isn't supporting them, and they're having some of these kind of mental breakdowns and miscues. And I think it's leading to a defense that is out on the field way too much and is exposed to more of these opportunities. Because I think when you watch some of the Houston game, like they do a good job early, right? They kind of, they get a good pass rush going. And again, Houston's offensive line is not good at the moment, or they're not playing well at the moment. And, they do some good things. They create pressure. They create tight window throws. But again, the more they're on the field, the more opportunity the offense has to throw stuff at them, the harder time they have and the less effective they are.
Yeah, one thing that Houston was able to do to alleviate some of that pressure was get the screen game going. So maybe this week is the week that finally that gets back going for Washington. That'd be cool. They've obviously had a couple weeks to retool it, or not a couple weeks, but 10 days to retool it, and I'm sure they're working on stuff full speed in practice and all that kind of stuff. And the timing, that's something that Dan talked about in his presser on Wednesday was, hey, what has been helped by this extra time and by getting to practice again? He's like the timing of offensively and defensively, certain route concepts, but we know the screen game is all about timing and coordination, the run game, timing and coordination. So hopefully that is something that can potentially come back. And, you wanted to follow up on that real quick?
Yeah, and I think that's maybe the most important thing I take away from watching the Dallas film is, they are what they are. But I look at, kind of watching the Pittsburgh film of the offense, the Philly film of the offense, and say, man, like they're not executing the way they need to execute. And so when I hear Dan say, oh, yeah, we got more practice time in this week because it's a longer week. Guys are fresher. We had 2 days off. We're fresh enough. We can actually practice on Wednesday. We can do what we need to do. That, to me, Dallas is what Dallas is. They're having their issues. But our offensive execution is the thing that drives this. And nothing has illuminated that for me more than like when I was playing and now that when I coach. Like, you can put the best plays in the world in. You can put them all in. You can be the smartest guy on paper. Kyle used to do this, right? It would just be like the perfect play, right? But if
how could it possibly go wrong?
Right. How could it possibly go wrong? But we didn't know the details. We didn't know exactly how to block it up versus this pressure. We didn't know exactly how to run the route versus this coverage. And now you've given the guys the opportunity to say, hey, let's really lock in on our execution and let's really own this versus all these different fronts and different looks. And that's, to me, like kind of the stuff you've been talking about with the screen game. That's the stuff you've been talking to me about, with the pass concepts in general. And I think this is the thing, is Dan is always so good at being like, it's about us. And when you talk to Cliff, he's like, it's about our execution. And I think those two things are so good to hear from the offensive play caller and the head coach. And so really, it doesn't really, I mean, it matters what's going on with Dallas. But like, that is the thing that I'm really excited about this week, is we've got more time on task to own and execute this game plan at a high level.
Yeah, no doubt about it. And I will also say this, as much as it is about us, so to speak, if you're the offense and that's what you're preaching, to try to get as close to perfection as possible, it doesn't have to be quite as perfect against this defense as it did against Pittsburgh or against Philadelphia or against Baltimore or against Cleveland. Like, the margin for error is a lot wider because they're not as good. There is more air. That angle doesn't have to be quite as sharp on that route because the defensive back has given you 4 extra yards for no good reason, because they're not as good and as locked in on their details. So that should be said as well. One of the things we actually I got a YouTube comment earlier in the week that I wanted to bring up. I meant to talk about this, or we meant to talk about this on the Tuesday show, but Terry McLaurin had been on an absolute heater going into that Philly game. And then obviously he does not have a productive day, barely heard from at all. All the wide receivers pretty much barely heard from at all against Philadelphia. What happened to that end? And then, do we expect a bounce back game from Terry, not just in terms of his production, but in terms of his involvement in the offense and kind of the intentionality with which Cliff had been getting him the football?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I'm very confident that this is a game that the offense gets back on track. And the reason I say that is for a lot of the reasons we just talked about, with the coverage structures that they're playing, how they're playing them. I know we've talked about this a lot, but Philly was very good. They were very good at playing their coverage structures, at matching concepts, at being on the same page. And there was a lot of stuff that they did where you could tell they were aware. And I don't know if it was they were aware of Terry specifically, but they were definitely aware of formation and what Cliff liked to do. So when Terry's by himself, he's been killing. He's been doing a great job. So like, we're going to run a slant, but hey, no, we're going to drop a linebacker right underneath that slant. Oh, hey, we're going to run a vertical, but we're going to have a guy underneath that just so the corner can play a little bit higher. And so, like, again, I don't know if that was specifically for Terry or if that was based on formation, and that's something you have to talk to Vic Fangio about. But that was a well-coached, well-locked-in group that executed at a high level. And I don't see that same level of detail from the Dallas Cowboys, at least as of right now. And again, people turn around, they can make they can make shifts at the end of the year, whatever. But I don't see that from them. So I do think it's just going to be like Cliff's going to call the offense. They're going to run the offense. And with this Cliff Kingsbury offense, we've talked about this before, when they get that momentum, when they get in that no-huddle mode, they kind of start stringing plays together. It simplifies the defense. You're going to find opportunities for Terry, whether that's on vertical routes, whether that's on hitches, whether it's slants, digs, and you're going to be able to get him involved. Now, I don't know if they're going to say we have to get Terry touches in the way that, like, we'll talk about this in a second, but like the way Mike McCarthy in Dallas does with Ceedee Lamb. I don't know if that's the best version of this offense, but he'll definitely get involved because I do think the offense will be able to find a rhythm. Like when you look back at the Philly game, it was hard, man. It was like Cliff really every play call had to be good. Every execution had to be good. That's not going to be the case here. We're going to get in rhythms. We're going to get string plays together and find ways to get Terry touches.
Yeah, I don't think the best version of this offense has Ceedee Lamb Ceedee Lamb levels of touches for Terry. However, I do think that there's clearly something between what happened in the Philly game and a Ceedee Lamb level that is a happy medium. And I appreciate that Cliff has a players not plays approach. And Dan also has some level of that of like, we got to get our studs the ball. And so that, while it can happen for a game, I just think that as long as this administration is here, there will not be these extended droughts for their best players in terms of production, because they know that's not how you win. They are very good at not losing the forest through the trees. And so I don't know what that's going to look like. I would try to be getting Terry on some slants and some digs and like some horizontal stuff. Obviously you're going to try to get him vertical some, but like Dallas will give you that air and that space horizontally if you can get him into the teeth of the defense, hit him in stride, and let him run. In the way that we saw the RPO against Pittsburgh. Hey, Terry, we're going to give you another one of those, and this time don't get caught. Joey Porter Jr. ran him down, obviously. So I think that getting him some of those opportunities is going to be key, and it's something that I think that they absolutely will be trying to do, and it's something that I think they probably will do with some level of success, probably a high level of success on Sunday.
No, I 100% agree. And I 100% agree with that. And I think they'll get him touches. The other thing I wanted to point out too, and you talked about this in the last question, was, you think it'll be easier to execute schematically, it'll be easier to kind of get on rhythm. And I also think like the one-on-one matchups in this game are a little bit more favorable for the Commanders offense. You know what I mean? That's something else we haven't really talked about specifically up front, where it's like, against Philly, against Pittsburgh, you got some absolute war daddies on the defensive line inside. And I think this offensive line does really well when it's like, hey, we can run our pin pull stuff, we can get after guys. And I think that when you look at Odighizuwa, a really good pass rusher, I think Mozzie Smith is playing better than people think. But again, not playing to the same level as like Jalen Carter or, the dude from Pittsburgh or, whoever it is, right? Like, I think those interior matchups are going to be so much more favorable for Washington this week. And that's something that I just wanted to kind of point out and just double click on. Like, yeah, we're going to get Terry touches, but I do think managing that interior defensive line, specifically in the run game, is going to help B-Rob be efficient, help Austin be efficient. And when those guys are super efficient, the offense is super efficient. And then all of a sudden, those touches to Terry are more important. The quick game becomes more impactful. The keeper play action game becomes more impactful. So that's something I just wanted to point out too, is like you mentioned, individual matchups are better. And those are probably two of the most important individual matchups that I think Washington will be able to exploit.
Last but not least on this Cowboys defense, and certainly not least, in fact, he's the number one thing that'll be in the meeting this week. What do you do in number 11? And is that easier now than it was, say, when these two teams matched up last year and the guy in the backwards hat was calling plays for Dallas versus being the head coach in Washington?
Yeah, it definitely seems easier than it was last year. I mean, last year, I think Dan did such a good job of being like knowing what Micah did really well and finding him good matchups. Like there's times where he's lined up over the center. He's lined up as a 3 technique. He's lined up as a 5, so like outside shoulder to the tackle, or he's lined up as an off-ball backer and he's on a stunt coming in. And so it's like, how do we target this rush? And so some of that stuff you see this year with Frankie Louvu, and how productive has Frankie been kind of rushing from all these different spots. Same thing with Dorrance Armstrong or Fowler, like just giving guys opportunities
Payne's
to attack
playing some more on
the pass rusher with. Yeah, but just attacking with more varied angles and giving the tackles different stuff to think about, or the offensive line different stuff to think about. Now with Zimmer, I think Zimmer's a really outstanding defensive coach, but it seems like Micah's lining up kind of almost exclusively on the defensive left, so over the right tackle. And again, Micah is a beast. He's one of the best pass rushers in the NFL. Definitely top 3, I would say, depending on who you talk to, depending on the year, but he is a dominant player. And that's great. He's going to dominate who's ever over there. But the good thing for an offense is if he's going to line up on the right, we can know how to send our protections. We can know how to where to send our chip out formationally. We know how to, whether we want to run at him or run away from him, we can kind of get that all called up because we know he's not going to be moving around the front as much. So I had a conversation at the Combine with an offensive line coach, and he was like, oh yeah, we had a great plan for Micah Parsons a couple years ago. And all we did was just make sure he was either getting chipped or sifted. So where the tight end lines up. So if Micah's on the defensive left, the tight end would be on the right. You come back across the formation and you just cut him down. It's like we just try to do that as much as possible so that he was thinking and kind of not being aggressive up the field because he didn't want to get cut. And now that opportunity becomes even easier because you understand where he is all the time. And I think that's something that is really important and a variable that I think while he's a dominant football player, it makes him somewhat easier to manage. It reminds me of like when Myles Garrett, we played against Myles Garrett in 2017 when I was with Atlanta. And we were so worried about him, but he always lined up on the offensive left. And so you kind of knew, like, the protection slide goes this way. We want to run away from him, so we're always going to run to the right. And you just could manage that a little bit differently. And I think that's going to be very helpful in this matchup versus Micah Parsons and the Dallas Cowboys, because you know where he's going to be every single play.
Take command. I'm Craig Hoffman. He is Logan Paulson. Let's take a look at the Dallas Cowboys offense led by Cooper Rush. And that offense taking on the Commanders defense, looking to bounce back after a strong performance for 3+ quarters again against Philly before Saquon Barkley got loose late in that game. The Cowboys have really struggled to run the ball this year, Logan, and I think a lot of folks expected that coming in, which is interesting because they've always had this reputation for a great O-line. Obviously, the running back situation for them is real bad. They don't like Rico Dowdle's their number one. All due respect to Rico Dowdle, like he's an NFL player, but should not be a number one running back on a good rushing team. So is it just the lack of running back talent? Is it scheme? Is it their offensive line regressing? Like, what is going on with the thing that has been the fail-safe for the Dallas Cowboys for 15 years at this point, going back to like when what's his name? DeMarco Murray was leading the NFL in rushing, and I was covering the team as a 23-year-old coming out of college.
Yeah, I mean, there's definitely been an offensive line regression. They used to be kind of in that same time period you're talking about. They were the best offensive line in football, like definitively. And they'd come out, and it was just like watching a well-oiled machine. Bill Callahan's the O-line coach. They've got a bunch of first-round picks out there, and they could just pretty much steamroll anybody, right? And so they're not that, because that was like one of the best units that I played against in my career, one of the best units that I can think about covering. Now you get like the Phillies and the Detroits, all that kind of stuff. They got Tyler Guyton at left tackle. He's a rookie. He's a raw developmental guy from Oklahoma. You see that when he plays. Tyler Smith, to me, is one of the better guards in the NFL. I think he's playing really good football. Cooper Bebe is playing center. He's a big kind of mauling guy inside. Zach Martin, Gold Jacket Hall of Famer, but definitely on the tail end of his career. And, think about when they were really good. Zach Martin was at the peak of his powers, right? And Zach Martin's been good for 10, 11 years. So this is not like a bash on Zach Martin. He went from the best guard in the NFL to like a good guard. And that's okay, because that happens to everybody. Father Time is undefeated. And then Terrence Steele, who hasn't really looked the same since the knee surgery, and again is struggling a little bit. But the reason I bring that up is, even though they're not the group they once were, when you watch those interior guys specifically, so Tyler Smith, Zach Martin, Cooper Beebe, in the run game, they get after you now. And they will put you on your back if you're not careful. And so then the question becomes, if those guys are being so physical on the interior, why can't they run the football? And so I think no better run explains this than when they run Wanda. So basically they have 6 offensive linemen, 6 blockers. So they have 5 offensive linemen and a tight end. The defense usually matches with a 6-man box. So 4 defensive linemen, two linebackers, right? And so the 6 guys in the blocking surface really do, I'd say, a good job of like moving guys off the spot, getting to the second level, kind of mashing people a little bit. The thing that shows up for me is when you're running Wanda versus in like a short yardage situation, there's always going to be either the nickel or the safety that's the 7th run defender. And that's usually a non-issue. Like when you watch San Francisco, it's never an issue because all their receivers are absolute dogs in the run game. They're going to push crack that safety and they're going to get 6 yards. Now, watching this, the people that are on the perimeter, so the receivers, so your Jalen Tolbert, your Ryan Flournoys, your whoever you want to say, Ceedee Lamb, right? Those guys have to block those safeties, have to block those nickels. And I see dudes who don't, it's definitely not emphasized for them. So what you run into quite a bit is just free runners to the running back. And it's not the O-line's fault. Like, they're not accounting for that player. That's a receiver to block. He has to block that guy. And so for me, That's the biggest thing that I see is sometimes the fullback's going to the wrong guy. Sometimes they're not, the combination's not great because there's line movement, but the interior of that offensive line is absolutely mashing people. It's just the other elements, the receiver, the fullback, the backup tight end who's inserting doesn't always go to the right person. And I think that really, really makes it challenging because you get these nickel players who are triggering on runs and hitting the running back in the backfield. And even if that guy breaks a tackle, like it's a 1 yard gain. And to me, that's where the inefficiency of the run game comes from. And we were talking about this before we started, but those are the Jeremy Chins for us. Those are the Quan Martins. Those are your Noah Igmanoganis. And talk about dudes that are physical, downhill, aggressive players. Those guys will do that. And so I think for as well as the interior of the offensive line is playing in the run game, they can't account for those guys. And so unless CeeDee Lamb decides to put his mouthpiece in and go block Jeremy Chin, like I think the running game is still going to struggle pretty mightily. So.
Yeah, and it could be Mike Sainer still, depending on what happens with Marshawn Lattimore. So we'll obviously talk about that and how Lattimore's presence would affect this in just a second. That's really interesting, and I feel like I remember a couple plays in that Houston game where their safeties just absolutely trigger downhill. Like there's one play that comes to mind, and one of their safeties just comes flying, and he's triggered pre-snap, is kind of guessing the snap count, and he's on it. And it makes me wonder, like, are there formational tells? Is McCarthy's play calling predictable? Like, is there something that on some of these it's just like dude's not blocking, but also on a play like that where the safety is tackling the running back fairly immediately for like a -3, that's a dude who guessed right. Because if that thing's a play action, that back winds up blocking him. Like now we're a body short, and hopefully, your quarterback can make a play. But this again goes back to where we started the podcast, where like, what does McCarthy have to mix it up? Because I'm sure Dan and Joe are going to arm this defensive unit with a ton of information to be on certain things in certain situations. And that's only going to that's going to exacerbate that problem as these DBs are flying around, especially in the run game.
Yeah, 100%. And I do think there is a little bit of like, a little bit of kind of formational indicator that they're going to run the ball. There is a little bit of like down and distance indicator that they're going to run on the ball. I definitely don't think there's enough for a safety to make the play that kid made. That was an incredible play. I think he's probably just blitzing, but like that was an incredible play that you're talking about. But there are some times where you're watching the film, you're like, this is a run. Like just the personnel is not right. Like they've got 2 tight ends in, one's in the backfield. Like they only do that when they're running the football. Because usually like Mike McCarthy, it's very similar to kind of like the Aaron Rodgers, like what Aaron Rodgers likes. He likes it spread out. He likes minimal motion. And if he's going to motion, he's going to motion to find a matchup. So like a great example of this is like, they're in a tight bunch. CeeDee Lamb's the guy inside. He motions to the outside guy. They kind of widen in the right way and they run a slant, right? Like that's kind of what he likes to use motion for, while like Kyle Shanahan or Matt LaFleur or Mike McDaniel, they use motion to kind of insulate and set up better angles in the run game. That's not really Mike McCarthy's thing. He's like, we're going to run Wanda, we're going to run duo, we're going to run some pitch, some crack toss and get after guys that way. And so there is a feel that's like, oh, there's 2 tight ends in, right? And they're attached, antennas up, because he doesn't like to do that a lot, right? So I think that kind of stuff is definitely things that the Commanders defense can key in on, and I think they can capitalize on. And it kind of speaks to another reason why they're struggling with a run. Like if you have these kind of formational tells a little bit, and I'm not saying it's all the time, but you can kind of feel it when you're watching film, like that's going to make it hard to run the football. Because like you said, like I can coach the receiver up to crack the safety, but if the safety knows, hey, they're probably going to run the ball here and gets downhill real fast, like that's a tough block for the receiver. So how do you maximize those? And he just doesn't. I don't think he ever has like really kind of focused on the run game. It's always been pass game spacing, and then the run's a secondary thought, and that's fine when you have Dak Prescott or Aaron Rodgers as your quarterback. But when Cooper Rush is your quarterback, you need to kind of find more effective ways to run the football, more consistent ways to run the football. So coming into this week, like, what's that wrinkle? Because I think he's a smart guy. I think he knows that. And I don't know if he's
but he's on a short week, and he's never done it.
That is it. It's a good point. And so that's where I'd say, like, an easy way to do that would be just, like, throw Trey Lance in there. like, hey, here's 15 plays for Trey Lance, and how do we prep that? And I think it's good, obviously, as the Commanders, we see Jaden Daniels every day in practice, so we have our kind of our file of how to handle a running quarterback. But I would expect something that's different than what they've been doing to help maximize that. Because like you said, they don't have an elite runner. Their offensive line in the run game, I think, is playing pretty physical, but they're not the group they once were. So you need to find some wrinkles and some ways to to maximize that group.
Yeah, there's a joke somewhere in here about the quarterback's name being Rush and them not being able to run the football and when he's in and all that kind of stuff. But I don't know where that joke is. Kind of like we did for the defense, Logan. Last but not least is definitely not least. We saved Parsons for the end there, saving Ceedee Lamb for the end here. One of the best receivers in football, incredibly dangerous. Not the only weapon they have. Like obviously you see Turpin take one to the house last week, but that's a very specific kind of weapon. Ceedee Lamb is a football nuke. He can cause a lot of damage, and just anyone in his path is in trouble. How do they do a good job of, despite all their other offensive struggles that we've talked about, getting him the football and still being a productive offense at times, thanks in large part to number 88?
Yeah, man, I think they just do a really good job of kind of like that. I'm trying to think of a good example of, I think, how fans would like you to treat a number one receiver. The Dallas Cowboys do a good job of treating Ceedee Lamb that way. It's like he is going to get touches. When the offense is slowing down, we get him a touch. And so, for example, like they run a little bubble screen on a Wanda early in the game, right? It's the same type of stuff Cliff would do with Terry, right? We need to touch. There's a bad number count, throw him the ball, first down. Oh, we're having a hard time. Here's a reverse, right? Oh, we're having a hard time. Here's a slant. And they don't really go, at least in the Houston game, I'm trying to think, in the Philly game, obviously that was a point of emphasis as well, but they don't really go very long swaths of time without making sure that he's involved in the offense. And it's screens, it's reverses, it's little touches on hitches and smokes, pre-snap reads. It's vertical routes, like when you get in press coverage, he's going to win on a vertical, we're going to throw the ball. They formation stuff where he's like by himself, all the receivers are on the other side, and it's like isolation basketball, like he's getting the ball on that. So it is you can tell it's a huge point of emphasis for them, and he delivers. I think he kind of plays like a true X in that way, where sometimes you give guys those opportunities and they don't quite work it out. They don't quite, it's always a little bit hairy, a little bit of a miss here, a little bit of a miss there. And that's not what he does. He does a good job of kind of winning those opportunities and maximizing them. I do think, though, when a team's going to do that, you need to just be aware of where he's at. You just need to be aware of where he is in the formation, the motion that they're using, because everything they're doing with him is intentionally designed to get him the ball. And like I said, it doesn't always marry up with the run game very well. So you kind of know, like if he's moving here, they're doing that on purpose because they're trying to get a certain matchup. And if they're trying to get that matchup, like, how do we cover this? And so I think that's something that is going to be really important to kind of keep an eye on. Because like you said, they do have guys that are really explosive, like Jalen Tolbert. Turpin is crazy explosive. So, and I think that's the other thing that's really interesting about the offense is if it's not an explosive play on like a vertical route to Ceedee Lamb, it's like a slant that people don't tackle well on, and then they're fast. Right. Fast for a touchdown or a little screen or whatever. Like their tight ends, I'm trying to remember which one it was because they have a lot of good ones. Schoonmaker, Ferguson do a really good job in the pass game, actually, like of kind of winning one-on-ones and attacking the seams. Like that's kind of where their explosive plays come from. It's not like, oh, here's the pen and we're going to work this stem and this is how you run your quarters coverage and we're going to manipulate the hook player and do all that. No, it's like we're going to run like, here, this, we're going to run goes, we're going to run a crosser, we're going to do this. And they kind of win on it, and I think that's how Mike McCarthy's always run his offense. And I think in kind of big moments like we just talked about, he leans on Ceedee Lamb to make sure the offense stays on schedule and make sure it goes. But they're not going to out-pen you. They're just going to be like, we're going to hit on the stuff we hit on and make plays.
Right, and that's why Dak was so valuable for them. And you want to know why? Like Dak was seen by a lot of the quarterback nerds, if you will, as one of the best quarterbacks. Like why does the football nerd media crew love Dak Prescott? You want a quarterback who's going to drill that seam ball to the tight end over a linebacker's shoulder, like right past his ear hole, Dak Prescott's your guy. He would throw it where a lot of quarterbacks wouldn't even throw it, and he'd hit it at a very, very high level. Cooper Rush is not going to do that because he's not Dak Prescott. And so some of that explosiveness in their offense is gone because the quarterback just doesn't see that throw is available, even though the route might be the same, the protection might be the same, all that kind of stuff. And so it really comes down to, like, can Ceedee slip a tackle? Can Turpin make a tackle? They're very reliant on their players to do that stuff because they run a style of offense. This goes back to, McCarthy and Rodgers and why they worked so well together for so many years. Like, it's an offense that if the quarterback is able to elevate it, it can be, the ceiling's really high. But if you don't have a quarterback, it's kind of, I would even rephrase it. The offense is dependent on the quarterback's level. And when it's Rodgers or Prescott, that level is really, 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 really high. When it's not, it's not as easy to plug and play like Marcus in for Jaden, like we saw in Carolina, where there's all this schematic stuff happening to elevate whoever is back there. And that should be an exciting opportunity for Washington, obviously, but they've got to go out and do it because it does come down to execution in a major way. And with that, having better players is always going to help with your execution. If they have Marshawn Lattimore, how different can the defense look? How does that change the Lamb matchup? And how big would that be specifically this week if he can finally make his debut?
I mean, I think it's all the stuff we've been talking about, with him. And if he were to come in, I think about, the improvement of Mike Sanderstill, the improvement of Benjamin St-Juste, the improvement of Noah Igbenogany, right? Like, all these guys are way better football players than they were. I don't know if they're better football players, but they understand the defense and the technique better than they did at the beginning of the season. And they're playing pretty good football, and so I like that group. When you bring Marshawn Lattimore in, I love that group when you bring Marshawn Lattimore in, because then everybody's kind of in a more a simpler version of what they're doing now. Benjamin St-Juste isn't matched up with A.J. Brown or Mike Williams one-on-one isolation. Like, that's Marshawn Lattimore, and that's what Marshawn Lattimore's done for the majority of his career, And then all of a sudden now St-Juste is to the safety help. He can play to the leverage, and he's not kind of on an island. And I think that's just going to elevate the back end. And then I think also, Joe Witt Jr. wants to play a little bit more man coverage. You can just tell from what he wanted to do early in the year. And so now get him out there, let it play more man coverage, match up with a guy like Ceedee Lamb, go to war with a guy like that. And again, when they try to play isolation basketball, who cares? We got our guy out there that can kind of go toe to toe with that. And we can play our zone coverage or play our kind of match principle that we want to play to the passing strength. And so all that's, or bring our pressure that we want to bring. And so I think that's, if he's back in the lineup, I really am excited to see where he's at health-wise, where he's at knowledge-wise in terms of the defense, because I do think he just immediately raises the floor of the entire group, because you move all your coverage players down, and all of a sudden the continuity of the secondary is significantly better because they're all in better roles. And so I really can't wait to watch that happen.
Yeah, I think that's such a good point on the Williams one, because I could already hear people being like, "Oh, St-Juste should be able to cover Mike Williams. He's like a number 4 receiver," whatever they want to say about Mike Williams. But it's like the whole point is he doesn't have to cover anyone one-on-one. It's like you can play single high, shade the safety to that side, and trust the man-to-man coverage on the other side. Whereas it's the other side saying we're still on Pickens. We're not going to leave that one-on-one. And so that just simple change of the math, I think, is really illustrative. And we'll see, hopefully this weekend, how that works. For the latest updates on that, that's what the radio is for. They put me on live every single day, 4 to 7. And we will be talking about that on the Hoffman Show once we learn more from Dan Quinn. Friday's edition of the show, we will have the injury report within the first 15, 20 minutes of the show typically. So tune us in on the Team 980 to get the absolute latest. We're recording this on Thursday morning. The latest as of now is that Lattimore did not practice on Wednesday, but they were hoping that he would get involved on Thursday. So TBD on that. Logan, anything else for this matchup that we want to hit before we get up on out of here?
No, man, really excited to watch the matchup. Obviously, Dallas week's a big deal. And I'm really excited to see the team kind of get back on track. After a nice long week of rest, good week of practice, let's get back on track. Let's get a W in versus Dallas.
Yep, and it'll be at Northwest Stadium. So we'll do the post-game show live from Northwest Stadium on Sunday. Logan and I will be there up in the press box. Hopefully it's a little warmer back in D.C. by then than it is out here in snowy Ohio. So I'll be back in town for that. Excited to be back. Excited to see him get on the field. And then we'll see you for the post-game show live on YouTube or in your feeds audio-wise immediately after. Film breakdown next Tuesday. And then we'll definitely record Wednesday the preview show for next week. So it'll be early in the week, but because of Thanksgiving, we'll get that done, and then we'll probably just go ahead and release it so you guys can have it if you're driving around, going to family. Have your Thanksgiving, and then tell the kids to shush on the ride home. You've heard enough of everybody, and listen to your old pals, Craig and Logan. No, don't do that. Enjoy your family time. What is wrong with you people? No, but we'll have all the usual stuff that you guys look forward to next week, even with the holiday. For Logan, I'm Craig. Wishing you and yours a very happy holiday season as we get into that, and enjoy the game on Sunday. Speaking of a holiday, it's Commanders Cowboys, everybody. Thanks for watching this clip of Take Command, which has a brand new home.
That's right. You can watch on YouTube at the Team 980.
You can also listen to full episodes in the free Odyssey app, which is now enabled with Apple CarPlay. So we'll just, follow you around.